Good morning. Welcome to the special edition of the Glendale City Council meeting, July 24th, 2007, regarding the fund balances and cash balances. May we have a roll call, please?
Council members Freeman.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver. Yusefian.
Here.
Mayor Najarian.
Here. Mr. Starbird.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, good morning. This study session I call a foundational study session for the ones that are going to follow, where you're going to be discussing the city's capital improvement program and priorities for the upcoming year. This one's foundational because it really just relates to the availability of resources that possibly you could tap or look at for various capital improvement programs, whether specialized within particular funds or whether more general in nature, such as our general CIP fund. So this morning we're not looking for decisions or direction. That's really just to impart information, so as you embark on a discussion of the city's capital needs, of which there are many, you'll have a sense of the amount and type of resources that possibly, based on your direction and policy, could be utilized for meeting those needs over the next 10 years. Mr. Allers has prepared a rather extensive overview. I say extensive just based on the number of PowerPoint slides. We can take as much time as you'd like going through those. We've anticipated the full morning dedicated to this. Had we started at 9:30, we would hope to have been done by 11 or so. We might go possibly past that, but the timing really depends on the amount of interest you have in the questions that you ask. So with that, let me turn to Mr. Allers. Ron?
Thank you, Jim. As way of background, about a week and a half ago, my department issued a report titled Council Study Session July 17th City Financial Reserves, and this has a lot more data than the PowerPoint slides do. The PowerPoint slides is a distillation of this, and I'll just briefly go through the report. The first couple pages kind of define terms for total fund balance, available fund balance, and what the reservations may be on the cash and the net assets of the city. And there's a few legal spreadsheets, legal-sized spreadsheets in here where every fund is detailed of the city, along with specific reservations that may be imparted to either the charter reserve or investment in capital assets and so forth. Following that is the latest City Council General Fund Reserve Policy that was adopted on January 17, 2006, and we'll go through that in the PowerPoint slide, along with a General Fund Reserve analysis showing a historical look going back to 1994-95, where you can see and track the reserve percentage and see if we are meeting our policy. In that legal spreadsheet, we started off a little over 10 years ago at 41.4%, having a general fund reserve, and we're anticipating finishing up June 30th, 07 at 33.9%.
Ron, can you direct us to exactly which
Sure.
exhibit and page you're referring to?
Sure. That one is Exhibit C, General Fund Reserve Analysis. It is a legal-sized spreadsheet,
Okay.
and it's titled Exhibit C up at the top.
Did you have some extra packets?
I sure do.
That was from 2 weeks ago. Carried over.
It's this one, it's this third legal sheet right here.
Okay, so the bottom line, Exhibit C, shows our general fund reserve percentage.
Correct.
From 94, 95 through this year.
Right. Through an estimate, we have not officially closed June 30th, 07 yet. We will in the next few weeks, but I am estimating at this point that we will have a reserve percentage of 33.9%. And through the PowerPoint slides, we will cover the general fund reserve policy, but as it stands now, our reserve policy has a minimum of 30% with a goal of 35%, with every dollar above 35% being automatically transferred to our capital improvement project fund.
And is that by, I'm sorry, is that by ordinance, or is that just by policy, or how do we?
That was an official resolution of the City
So
Council.
it's a
passed
pour
in
over.
January.
Anything above 35% pours over into the CIP.
Correct.
Once again, it's a policy, so by another resolution, you could modify the policy.
Correct.
But we haven't hit that in the last 2 years.
The only
obviously, so.
part of the policy the council wouldn't be able to modify on its own action is the minimum reserve that's spelled out in the charter, which is the roughly 19 million.
It is on this spreadsheet.
It's noted in the first page of the handout.
Right. It is 17.8 million.
17.8 million. It's estimated at roughly half the city's annual property tax revenue.
Correct.
Mr. Draymond.
Yeah. Mr. Rollers, on that bottom line that the mayor was just speaking about in Exhibit C, we see it, we see the percentages going up and down from 1994?
Yes.
94, 95 to the present. In the last, looks like 3 postings on the right there, 2004, 2005, 35.8%. Then 2005, 2006, 31.3%, and then estimated for this year, 33.9%. Why is it so low there compared to just a few years ago when it's 52.3 or 53.2? Is that because of bad planning or crazy spending, or Mr. Starbird went out and bought a chain of ice cream parlors? What caused that? Or was it just simply that the council had decided to for reasons related to investing in the city, to spend that money, or to use the funds in another way? I mean, was it just through carelessness or recklessness? What happened?
The vast majority of the decrease is due to investing in the city in the form of purchasing open space. So, for example, we have purchased Flint Canyon, Murchison property, Oakmont View 5. We also shored up some of our internal service funds to the tune of $6.5 million about 3 years ago, and now was a transfer out of the general fund. So it was not due to operating expenses exceeding our budget. We lived within our budget for all of these years that you have seen here. It was due to one-time expenses, capital expenses.
In fact, we not only live within our budget, generally each year we have generated a fairly sizable surplus at the end of the year. And I think it was the year that we transferred some of that we had a relatively high surplus year. We transferred some of that year-end savings to make our other internal service fund reserves healthier. There were a number of open space purchases that occurred in 04, 05, 05, 06, like Polson, Murchison. Preceding that had been Oakmont View 5. So we had a series of open space purchases in the neighborhood total of $35 million.
Correct,
if I recall correctly.
but not all of that was borne by the
Right,
general fund.
right.
General fund contributed a majority of that money, but not
Right.
all of it.
Right.
Mr. Quintero.
What are some of the internal service funds?
That is in our PowerPoint presentation, but they're all funds that support the operations here of the city. So a large fund is our workers' compensation fund. We are self-insured up to $2 million for workers' comp, and we pay out all of those expenses out of internal service funds, where we charge the operating departments based on their salaries and their employees and what their historical usage of workers' comp has been. We also have self-insurance funds for our equipment replacement, which funds police vehicles, fire apparatus, public works vehicles that are out of the general fund. We also have it for our liability funds, where for tort claims and legal actions, we use an internal service fund structure to pay for all those costs. Instead of making the departments bear that, we actually charge a premium to all the operating departments, and they help fund that and centralize the cost in there. And there's a lot more funds than just those 3, and we'll go
Mention them,
and
yeah.
we'll have that here on the.
It might be useful on that note if we start to go through the PowerPoint presentation, which gets into some of the.
Okay, I have one more. So the actual charter requirement is for 12% of the annual general fund revenues to be established as a reserve.
That is correct.
So the city council...
Let's be clear.
Let me finish.
Well,
The city council, I'm talking to Mr. Allers, and the city council has made the decision as a matter of public policy that we would do a minimum of 30%, and the goal is 35%. That's right, Mr. Allers. It's 12% by the charter. The city council has...
The charter requires that we set aside half of our property tax.
That's the point I was trying to make, Mr. Quintero. It's not 12%. The charter requires that we set aside approximately half of our property tax revenues in a given fiscal year. That just happens to be currently about 12%. But the charter provision was based on the need to have working cash flow in the general fund, so the city wouldn't have to rely on what used to be called tax anticipation notes each year to fund our working capital. So it happens to be about 12%, but that's not what the charter provides for. Charter provides a general provision for half of our annual property tax revenues.
I'd like to see that passage whenever you can find it or whatever.
Mr. Yusefian.
Scott?
I think one item that, since the public is unable to see our exhibit, which I think it will be helpful, as Mr. Draymond did ask the question, what happened? Is it mismanagement or what? In 1994-95, the general budget was $82 million. And out of that $82 million, we had another $34 million, which was the reserve. So it's the 41% of that $82 million. Today, in 2006-2007, the general fund budget has changed from $82 million to $161 million. So it's double what it was 13 years ago. And it's only 33.9% of $161 million. So it's actually $54 million in dollar amounts that is in the reserve. In this chart, as I look at the highest we've had as far as dollars is concerned, is in 2002, 2003, we had $61,205,000. This is the highest we had in this 13 years that we're showing. I don't know, in the past, has it been higher than this?
No.
There have never been any higher than this?
Not as far as nominal dollars.
Okay. So as far as nominal dollars, the highest peak we ever hit was $61 million, and that was the year that, and the following year, it goes down to 56. And that was the year that we actually moved in a direction of purchasing Oakmont 5. And the following years, you see a drop because we started buying Murchison and Paulson and so on and so forth. And so we're back up from 2005, 2006, which was $46 million, to $54 million today. So when you look at percentages, it doesn't really look good because I think it's a function of what your general fund is. So if you reduce your general fund, your reserve will be higher. Right?
Right. It's a ratio. I mean, it's a percentage.
It's a ratio. Right. So.
And let me, along those lines, is this really the best way to measure or to set a standard for a reserve? Because, as we know, that reserve money is ultimately intended to do something, to repair a bridge or to build a pool or to whatever, critical need there would be. And as we go along, we know that the cost of construction and the cost of real estate, is certainly on the rise, generally speaking. So is this the best practice for municipalities to set it as a percentage, or is it better to set some sort of target sum which would increase or should increase at least with the CIP as the years go on as a target, rather than this percentage? As Mr. Yusefian said, we could slash our budget one year and our reserves will go through the roof as the ratio goes. So what is really the best practice are we practicing the best methods of setting reserves?
Most cities do have a general fund reserve policy, and it varies across the map from lows to highs. When we did a survey about 6 years ago, the average was around the 10 to 15% range as far as an official policy of the city. And to use a percentage on your general fund reserve is actually a good idea, because your general fund is mainly composed of operating costs, and with 85% of that being salary and benefits. So having your general fund be, the reserve be a percentage, keeps up with inflation, mainly wage inflation and benefit increases, or just benefit inflation. We do have other reserves that are set aside for capital purposes, as you were mentioning, Mayor.
Mr. Starbird.
Yeah, we should note in the survey that we saw a number of cities that I would describe as sort of the same quality of Glendale had sizable reserves. I think we were like Burbank, for example. I forget the others, but I think Santa Ana was one. Torrance. Generally, cities that have a greater
Santa Monica.
Santa Monica, that have a much stronger revenue base, but. You won't find in literature anywhere, you won't find a standard that says thou shalt have X percentage reserve. It has to be keyed to, the local values, the local issues. It has always seemed to me that a city should have a prudent reserve. Glendale's generally had a value of being a cash and carry city. That's what established the charter provision in the first place, which it might be interesting to note that the section in the charter that provides for it is called the General Reserve Fund, and it says that the City Council shall maintain the permanent revolving fund now established, known as the General Reserve Fund, for the purpose of keeping the payment of the running expenses of the city on a cash basis. And in effect, the general fund can make loans to other funds to help keep them on a cash basis. Going on to say that generally it's the value of the city to have our operations on a cash basis, and that the city council can essentially have the general fund assist other funds on that basis, provided that in any fiscal year in which the total balance of said general reserve fund exceeds 50% of the total amount of the anticipated ad valorem tax receipts for the year, the council can appropriate the excess for any city purpose without returning the same to the general fund. So in effect, it was saying that if you've got enough reserves in your general fund to keep the city on a cash basis, so you're not having to borrow, because back in those days, property taxes was probably the largest single revenue source of the general fund, without borrowing, that as long as you could do that, then that was a level of reserve that you were required to have. Beyond that, the council could make a decision how you spend that. I've always been of the philosophy that it seems to me it doesn't make sense to just amass money for the sheer purpose of amassing money. There needs to be a purpose behind it. As has been noted here, you can have as much value investing your funds in the right investments, investments in terms of infrastructure, than you can just amassing money in the bank. So any policy on reserves should be backed with, I think, a rational, prudent, and in my view would be, in Glendale's values, a conservative approach. But just to amass money for the purpose of saying, look at us, we've got $100 million in the bank, I don't think is necessarily a rational policy. That's not to say that the level of reserves we have is inappropriate. Glendale's always had, I think, the luxury of having a very strong, relatively conservative financial policy, and have been able to have relatively sizable reserves in most of our funds. Some funds are better than others.
Mr. Draymond.
The reason I asked the question earlier was not because I really think the money was mismanaged. I asked, or that Mr. Starbird had actually bought a chain of, used the money to buy a chain of ice cream outlets. But
We haven't had any of the ice
not
cream.
lately.
Haven't had any, huh?
But the reason I ask is because clearly at the heart of all of this, and people watching, not only those people who are brave souls that are watching this outside of this room, there are 26 items on this CIP study session list. I think there's 26. Anyway, they're all sort of competing, and the people who have interest in each of these are in essence competing for a pool of funds. All of this today I view as what size, trying to identify what size that pool of funds is. And when you look at the percentages on Exhibit C, if you didn't ask the question or flesh out the question as Mr. Yusefian just did, you would look at those percentages and say, wow, we've had declining reserves since 1994. And I was not convinced that was the case. So it's not that I was just blindly asking. I was asking also for a little more illumination. But also I want to, Mr. Mayor, I also want to just echo or elaborate on what the city manager was just saying, the idea about reserves. There are fundamental differences of opinion as to how reserves should be used. And how a homeowner will tell you that if you're in need of a new roof, the question would be, and you have the funds to spend, would you leave it in the bank, or if there is a need and there's a sale on new roofs and you have the opportunity to put a new roof on, would you opt to do that? Reserves, yes. Prudent reserves, absolutely. But to simply say, we won't spend funds simply so we can say we have a larger and larger reserve doesn't make sense either. So, and I think that's part of what the city manager was just saying, without the analogy about the roof.
Okay, let's press forward, Ron, on the presentation.
Our purpose today in the overview of our fund balances is to do a complete review of all of our city funds, and we will highlight restrictions and options related to those fund balances. Some of the fund balances do have restrictions on them, as we were just talking about the charter required reserve. We really can't spend that money. If we do spend it, we have to return it back to the general fund within the year that it is spent. And also to identify impacts of potential changes in city policies related to fund balances, and we've already had partial discussion on that with the whole general fund reserve set by City Council. We've been already speaking about purposes of reserves, and I'll quickly go through this list, and I expanded on these topics in the written report that you received a week and a half ago. One is to comply with legal and accounting requirements. One of those is our city charter requires it, and so we have to comply with that. And that is basically it as far as a charter requirement is only dealing with our general fund. There's kind of an implied in the charter that all of our funds will remain in cash positive, but it's not specifically delineated. And second one is GASB does require that we do maintain cash in excess of our, that we don't go into negative cash for our non-general fund operations. Mainly that's dealing with our internal service funds, which we will go to in detail later. Second purpose of reserves is to provide funding for emergencies or natural disasters. We need to have reserves or cash in the bank, if you will, in terms of if there's an earthquake, a flood, or some kind of other emergency that may befall the city. Now, while FEMA may reimburse that, we always have to spend the money first, and so we need to actually have the money to spend. And second thing is that maybe FEMA won't reimburse us for all of the costs, which they tend to not. They tend to get us well above 90%, but they may also deny projects, which has happened in the past as well. So we do need to have reserves set aside for emergencies or natural disasters that may happen or occur in the future. We also use the reserves as general interest earnings in our general fund. We have approximately $4 million that we are anticipating earning in this current fiscal year, 2007-8. And what is that generated from? It is generated from the reserves in our general fund earning interest in the bank, if you will. So it is an ongoing source of income. Again, we need to weigh that versus investing in our infrastructure. We would rather repair things, or use the roof analogy, to actually, that's a much greater use than just earning interest revenue. But we need to also realize that it is an ongoing source of funding for the general fund.
Mr. Quintero.
The interest is also earned, well, the interest is earned on all funds, not just a general fund. Is that correct?
Correct. That is correct. Mr. Raymond.
Yeah, and I just conceptually philosophically, I just want to make sure that we're not saying that prudent economic development or beneficial CIP expenditures shouldn't be made, simply because to do so would mean we'd have spent the money and therefore won't receive interest on it. I mean, that's clearly not the message of number 3 here, or whatever number bullet point
Right.
this is up here.
You are correct, Councilmember Draymond. You actually probably have a much higher return on your investment if you would invest it in a street project, as Mr. Zern outlined a number of weeks ago. When you get beyond a certain point, the cost of repairing a street escalates dramatically. You'd be better off pouring your money into streets than letting it sit in the bank and earn 4.25%.
And if I can, Mr. Mayor, it does seem to me that generating interest isn't necessarily the purpose of a reserve. It ends up being sort of the frosting on the cake. When you have a reserve for the other purposes of a reserve, then if you invest it wisely as we do, then you generate some interest. That can start to become a little bit of a hole that you dig for yourself, because with the size of reserves we have, it can generate in the millions of dollars every year, and you start to become reliant on that. So that when you do have a need to utilize what we call the reserves, I prefer to call them the fund balances available for appropriation, because reserves implies you've made a conscious decision to tuck them away, then you've got that reliance on them. And frankly, that's where the general fund has gotten to over the years because of the size. We generate how much in interest income, Ron?
About $4 million.
About $4 million. That's a fairly sizable amount of resources in the general fund. And as a result, when we do have a need to use the fund balances or the reserves, then we've also got this secondary issue of, oh yeah, that means, however, now we're going to have a loss of ongoing income in the general fund. So it becomes a reliance that you create for yourself.
Mr. Draymond.
And then a question also, because over the course of that year, if you look at all the different kinds of projects that a city like Glendale is looking at, the increasing costs for all of those projects, or even a percentage of them over the year, would be more than $4 million.
Exactly. Yeah, that was Ron's point on street improvements. As Steve Zern will tell you, with the increase in costs we've seen, for example, in street improvements or land values, deferring a project for a year or 2 or 3 can have a much greater cost associated with it than your interest earnings on your money.
Correct. Ron, wasn't there a new GASB rule, GASB 44 or 45, that says we have to, for unfunded employee retirement benefits, we have to set aside, what is something on that? You have to set aside or have an amount in your current reserve that would pay for that for future years, or what? Why don't you explain that particular?
Sure.
If you know what I'm talking about,
Yes,
that
I do.
particular rule.
It's GASB 43 and 45. They're kind of a tandem GASB rules. GASB stands for Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which is we comply with all of their regulations. And 43 and 45 talk about OPEB, which is another acronym, stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits, which is all non-pension benefits, if you will. The city of Glendale has just one, which is our promise for our retirees as far as medical insurance is concerned. And we provide a plan to provide that benefit to the retirees. And so we have to set aside a costing for that. And that rule takes effect June 30, 2008. So we will have it in a year.
And
to
what are we
comply
looking
with
at?
it.
What's your estimate?
Our estimate, there's 2 main components of it, and I won't bore you with it, but the 2 components add up to about $33 million, $34 million, if my recollection is correct.
So June 8, we're going to take a hit of $33 million. Not a hit, but a claim on the reserve, an accounting claim on the reserve for $33 million.
Yes.
Correct in that understanding?
Yes. We will actually show that as a liability of the city. There's nothing in GASB 43 or 45 that stipulates that we have to set aside the cash for that liability. So we will recognize the liability of $34 million, and we actually have been recognizing it on our books since 1989 or 88, and we've been setting aside cash. So we have, my recollection's a little, we have under $10 million, maybe about $8 million set aside for this reserve already.
So we're about $20 million short, let's say.
Right.
So what's going to happen in 2008, Ron? Are we going to, if you had to give us a reserve percentage, what would you tell us? Would it be, even though we don't have to take the cash and put it in there, is it still appropriate to say we would have a 34% reserve at that point, or was it going to be something like a 15, 20%?
Well, you have to also recognize that our promise to pay for our retirees is out of all the operating funds of the city. The general fund has approximately 1,100 employees that are funded there, and we have 2,000 plus employees of the city. So they are a little over half. So the general fund should be, if you want to call for it, they should pony up about half of that liability. But again, we have a plan to actually fund that OPEB, where we are putting aside money to amortize that unfunded liability over 20 years. It's the same kind of plan we're doing with our pensions. Our pensions are currently underfunded by a few percentage points, and we are paying extra every year into PERS to amortize that unfunded liability away so that we will be 100% funded within, let's see, for safety it's 30 years, and for miscellaneous it's 12 years. For our retiree medical, we have a 20-year plan to pay off that liability.
Mr. Starman.
And that discussion is why it's important to understand the difference between the balance sheet provisions for any one of our 60 funds and what we look at to determine what is the resources available for appropriation. If you looked at the balance sheet for the general fund, you'll see a fund balance of a particular number that Ron can point out to you. That's not reflective necessarily of the resources that are available for appropriation. By that I mean resources available to be spent by the city. You've got to essentially pick your way through the various balance sheet provisions and sort out what are those things that do take your cash or your resources available for appropriation for which you then can't spend it, and what are those things that are really balance sheet provisions that may be very long term that don't have an impact necessarily on your year-to-year budgetary operations. Let's look at any of the enterprise funds where we book the assets, the fixed assets. That would imply, if you just looked at the fund balance, that would imply that you've got all kinds of resources in the fund, but those are fixed assets. A large portion of those are fixed assets. You can't go spend them unless you first sell them. So to understand the ability of a fund to tap into resources for expenditures, you have to really take a look at the balance sheet and pick through the balance sheet provisions for each of those to see what are the funds available for appropriation.
And so are you going to elaborate on that as we go through? Because I think that's the whole point here, is to see how much money there is located where, how much has strings attached, how much is not attached, where's our bottom line of danger zone below the charter, et cetera. So with that in mind, keep going, Ron.
All right. We're about midway through this slide.
Let me interrupt you.
It's related to something on this slide, a different topic, though, Mr. Mayor. Ron, are we at the section provide funding for economic uncertainties? Is that
Correct.
where we are? Okay. That was where I had a question. So why don't I wait on my question until after you've addressed that bullet point?
This is kind of multi-pronged, provide funding for economic uncertainties. I will remind Council we went through a rather dramatic recession in the early to mid-'90s, where our revenue estimates on some of our economic sensitive taxes went down dramatically. I'm thinking sales tax, property tax. Property tax also had the fun ride of being rated by our state government, which this year is to the tune of $7.9 million, known as ERAF, Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund, where the state came in and just took a large chunk of our property taxes, and they've taken it forever, as it seems. So to have reserves also takes into account when our revenue estimates don't meet our projections because of something happening in the economy, either a deep recession or the state taking our funds. Another threat that we have on the horizon, which Council has been briefed on, is our utility users tax as it relates to wireless. and that we've actually set aside $4 million in our general fund for that anticipated threat whenever it will materialize, or if ever it would materialize. So that's a reason for the economic uncertainties, either threats from revenue estimates not meeting projections or threats from revenues actually being taken from us either by court action or by state government or from an I guess even from the federal government, where they have taken revenues that they used to provide for us and cut them back. So, Councilmember
Mr.
Draven?
Yusefian.
Sorry.
Ron, I remember 94, that's when the earthquake hit, and then you had 95, 96, 96, 97. If you look at your chart on Exhibit C, you would see that the reserves didn't really decrease, it actually increased. I remember those days that we used to meet in room 105 and talk about the budget, and I specifically remember council at the time, with Sheldon being there and Eileen being there. They literally went out through a list of all the employees and painstakingly eliminated job after job after job. Now, granted, they were unoccupied at the time, but nevertheless, they eliminated a lot of positions to basically reduce the general fund budget. So this way, they didn't have to go to the reserve. So they really didn't use much of the reserve. What they did is they actually cut the budget to deal with some of the deficit issues that they were dealing with from 94 to 96. So I don't think the reserves are there to do this. I mean, you can take a look at your general fund budget first and see if there are places you could cut from, which we haven't done over. We've been lucky. The income has been coming in for a long time, and we haven't really have to go through this since 1996. We haven't done that. So in many cases, we have added more people and more people and more people, and that's part of the reason our general fund budget has increased. Also, we transferred a whole bunch of things that we used to do in capital improvement budget and called it a capital improvement, even though it was a general fund issue. We transferred that into the general fund issue. So consequently, now we have a large general fund, but in case there is some of these things, like we have a problem with UT tax or whatever, there is nowhere. Let me ask you this question: does it keeps us from going back and doing what the previous councils did in '96, which is looking at our general fund budget and economizing there instead of just going to our reserve and just spending the money from there?
No. What that $4 million does is actually buy us a year to actually implement the strategies that we would use to reduce our general fund budget, so that we wouldn't have to be so draconian and actually even doing layoffs or what have you. We could actually go and do a more strategic look at either vacancies or actually eliminating whole programs and then finding other positions for if there's actual people that are in those programs. So it buys us 12 months is what it buys us.
In my mindset, being economically sound is not draconian. So just want to let you know that.
Mr. Draymond.
Well, I'm glad that Councilmember Yusefian points out that our predecessors didn't handle that by firing people. They eliminated
it was empty positions.
Yes,
and we
exactly.
still have some in today.
Yes.
And that would be music to the ears of several people who are at council almost every Tuesday talking about that very thing. And the reason I have a question, Mr. Mayor, because it relates to something you asked a moment ago about whether reporting these things as percentages is really beneficial in communicating the information, because just as Mr. Yusefian points out, you say, or it says here in in our packet, therefore another purpose of the reserves is to provide a protection against revenue estimates not meeting projected levels. This occurred in a dramatic way during the severe recession of the mid-1990s, doesn't mention the earthquake, and so you look at that on the matrix and you see, well, that might have been a bad time in the 1990s, but we see a very large percentage of reserves. So it seems in conflict. It would seem to be in conflict with what is written in our packet here. It leads you to ask the question how much of our reserves were actually spent during those dramatic and dastardly mid-1990s, and how much of it was due to reversals related to economic downturns or natural disasters. Because to look at the percentages, you wouldn't see it.
Mr. Starbird.
Ron, I can recall a table, and we don't have it in our current budget or in the annual financial report, that went back before 94, 95, went back to went back to the 80s at least, I think. And I think there's only been 2 years, if I can recall, that the general fund has actually dipped into the reserves to remain balanced. And I think one of those was right in the mid-throes of the recession. It seemed to me it was something in the neighborhood of $6 million at that time, which by Glendale standards must have been at that time a huge issue, because it's something that I don't think we had ever done before. And frankly, most cities were facing the same thing. But from a general financial policy, it isn't good to base ongoing operating on reserves or one-time resources. It just creates a structural problem that will end in a disaster, as the state has learned and continues to learn time and time again. So I think in the history of recording these things and reporting them, I think in probably 20 years or 30 years, there's maybe been twice, Ron, even in the depth of the recession of the early 90s, that we've actually had to dip into the reserves to any sizable extent.
Ron's actually going to clarify.
Okay.
What this one is for is actually dealing within that specific year. So, for example, and I can add numbers to this chart, in 92-93, we had a deficit, if you will, of $2.2 million. Now, it was all due to revenues not meeting expectations. And we dealt with that with some cutbacks that year when council was preparing the 93-94 budget. 93-94 comes around, the state comes in and takes $3.2 million. The recession gets deeper. We thought we were doing well at just holding our revenues even, and they continued to go down. So in 93-94, we actually had a little bit greater than $6 million. I think it was $6.5 million deficit that year. And that was mainly due to revenues not meeting expectations. One was the state came in and just swiped our money. We did not anticipate that. And then council for 94-95 dealt with that issue by going through a series of cutbacks. So the council has always had a balanced budget when they've adopted the budget. What this does is provide for, we anticipated revenues coming in at X, and they come in much less than X, what actually occurs.
Right, but they didn't take the money from the reserve. That's what I was saying.
Well, the council didn't, but we did take it from reserves, because that's what happened. We spent more money than we took in that year, so it automatically comes from reserves.
That's what the reserves provide you for, which is some time to react, so you can adjust. Reserve shouldn't be viewed as a permanent solution, because eventually your reserves are gone, and then you've got a structural problem that you're not addressing with your ongoing resources. So in that case, the resources came in less than anticipated in that fiscal year. Even though they had started to react, it takes time to adjust. They ended up being in the red in the budget at the end of the year, which meant the reserves were used. And going into the next year, they adjusted by making cutbacks so that they brought the budget back into a structural stability, so they weren't relying on reserves anymore.
Correct.
Okay, so they froze positions, mid-year hiring freeze, eliminated positions in the upcoming year's budget, and they adjusted, which is what most cities in California were doing at that time, the same
Mr.
sorts of
Draymond?
things.
I just wanted to know if that was the official term, Mr. Allers, that the state swiped it. I was just wondering if that was the technical.
Yes.
Well,
Actually,
we could
we
use
u-
other S words
Yeah,
like
we-
stolen.
Yeah, we use stronger terms usually.
Okay.
Okay, Ron, let's
Okay.
go through.
Try to finish this slide. It does provide financial flexibility, and we have used this to, one, purchase open space. We have used also the reserves to do a new police program where we call it our 25 new officers, where we funded a large chunk of that, or a large portion of that, from the general fund. So reserves do provide opportunities for seed money to start new programs or to purchase land or invest in our infrastructure. It does provide financial peace of mind having reserves in the bank, and it does allow us to accumulate cash for major projects, and as we will discuss in the coming weeks about which major projects to fund out of our CIP. Here is the total city, our fund balances and net assets for June 30th, 2006. I do not have 2007 numbers. We will close that up in a few weeks. But if you want to think of it, our fund balance citywide is $1 billion and $1,036 million strong. And what we do is that is a number that cannot be spent because there's either reservations on the cash or there is also investments in our infrastructure, as Mr. Starbird was pointing out a few minutes ago. So if you want to think of it, the city is book value worth $1,036,369,000. That is our book value, if you will. Out of that $1 billion, we take encumbrances of $26,901,000. Encumbrances are contracts that the city has entered into, but we have not spent the money. So we have entered into a contractual relationship to retrofit MSB. We have not actually written a check yet for the completion of that project, but we have a contract for a certain dollar amount. So that is what an encumbrance is. Our charter required reserve, which we've already talked about at June 30th, 06, is $16,495,000. Our book value of property held, this is our redevelopment agency where they have gone out and purchased property in either zone of the redevelopment, and that value on the books is $66,150,000.
Ron, in June of 06, we hadn't transferred the property to Caruso yet?
No, we have not. We did that in 06, 07.
So today, that number will just be a small fraction of what it was then?
Correct. June 30th, 07, we'll see that number dramatically
Most of
reduced.
this was the Americana property?
Correct.
And also reflected in the grand total then, right? I mean, if you're reducing
Right.
that, then
Exactly.
our $1 billion is
Well,
going
going to be reduced as well. That is correct. Our loan receivable is $3,400,000. These are two loans from GRA, $1.8 million to the school district for Moist Field, and the other $1.6 million to Embassy Suites. Principal and interest is $63,325,000, which deals with our debt service funds. We have two bonds outstanding in our redevelopment agency, and we also have our police building bonds, and that's where the majority of that money is where we set aside the cash to pay off the bonds over the 30 years. So that cash is going to be amortized. It's earning interest and also going to be drawn down so that by the end of the 30-year bond, we will have anticipated $0 left in that fund. Our another acronym, this one stands for Southern California Air Quality Management District. Emission controls, this is dealing with our electric fund and with the restrictions placed on it by AQMD. So there is a reservation on their fund balance of $6.2 million. Landfill post-closure in the amount of $17 million. The city owns our own landfill, and we have to set aside money for the eventual closure of that landfill, for the maintenance for 30 years to maintain it once it's closed. We actually don't set aside money to close it. We are setting aside money to maintain it for 30 years after it's closed. That we have set aside cash to the tune of $17 million as of 06. Due to the general fund is $67 million. This is the GRA debt to the general fund of $67 million. And our largest number on this chart, investment in capital assets, $435,850,000. This, as you can imagine, is our electric fund, our water fund, and our sewer fund. Those are the three main players in here. We also have investment in capital assets for refuse and some of our other enterprise funds, but the majority of it is those three funds. So once we subtract out these numbers, which add up to a total of $702 million, we have what is called an unreserved, unrestricted fund balance or net asset of $333,941.
The $3.4 million was what? The loan receivable? What was that again?
It is $1.8 million to Glendale Unified School District to do Moist Field.
You loan them the money?
We loan them the money. That is correct. And
It's very cooperative of us. Let it not be said we do not cooperate with the school district. And that will be repaid?
that will be
How many years?
It was a loan secured by their future tax increment.
correct.
From the redevelopment.
From redevelopment agency.
Okay.
I have a question.
Mr. Yusefian.
Ron, you said that $1 billion is our net asset. Basically, does this include the city hall, the fire stations, and all of that stuff?
No, it does not. It does not include all the capital assets of the
So
general
when
government.
you say, so this is just money?
No.
No. We will get into all the separate funds. It's not the value or the worth of all of our governmental assets in our streets or
What
our
I'm trying to
buildings.
get to, it says fund balances and net asset.
Yes.
And then you said our net worth, grand total, is $1 billion.
Yes.
Okay? And you said if this was a corporation, that would be its value.
Yeah.
In a corporation, you have all your liabilities, you have all your assets, and some of them are hard assets, some of them are liquid assets. You know, you got cash, and then you have power plant or whatever else. Okay. In that $1 billion, that's what I was looking in here and I couldn't find, is where is our MSB building, where is our fire station, our parks, our open spaces, and all that stuff. So what is the value of this government and its assets? So it's going to be more than $1 billion, wouldn't it?
That is correct.
Okay, so what is the value of all of those? Has anybody done calculations? Do we know? Is it another $1 billion? Is it $500 million?
Everything? Throw in the
Everything.
kitchen sink?
Kitchen sink included, you know? Mr. Kasakian's computer, you know, all of that.
These PowerPoint presentations,
Yeah. Worthless.
must have a fortune in these, I tell you.
They're probably a negative.
The real estate alone, that should be
Yeah.
fairly easy to
Right.
establish.
I will get between the difference of book value and market value. Book value is what we have historically paid for these items.
Okay.
So our book value net assets is $1,557,200,000 as of June 30th, 06. That's
1.5.
our historical cost. We have owned, well, City Hall for how many decades now? I don't even know.
Right,
We have
but-
owned all our parks when land was a lot less expensive than it is today.
Right. So in reality, actually, while some of the buildings may have depreciated, the land has appreciated.
But we don't
So-
show that.
Right. So 1.5 billion is considered to be very conservative.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's complying with GASB, so it is
Right.
our historical cost of all of these items.
Okay. And does that
All of
include
our-
the rolling stock on this?
Yes.
It does.
Yes.
Okay. So it's the fire trucks and the
Right.
helicopters and everything else.
Right.
Mr. Starbird.
Well, and this is all leading to a problem, which is why it's so hard to have the public understand all of this accounting stuff. Because in governmental accounting, different funds, different accounting entities are treated differently for accounting purposes. You have governmental funds of the city, like the general fund and the CIP capital fund, that generally do not book and depreciate their assets and write off the expense of that. Then you have funds like GWP that are operated like enterprises, and like a private business, they do book their assets and they do depreciate them and take that into consideration in their income statements for determining their profit and loss at the end of the year. So governmental accounting is a more complex beast than generally private accounting, because you've got these different types of accounting entities that we call funds that are accounted for differently and reflected differently. That's why it's hard when you take the big number here of $334 million in unreserved and unrestricted. In order to really understand what is available that the council has the ability to set policy on its spending for, you really have to tear into the city's 60 different funds, which is why we have so many PowerPoint slides here today, because that $334 million is further restricted based on statute. For example, you can only use Prop A and Prop C money in our transportation fund for the purposes for which that money is allotted to us. The same with housing funds. So taking the $334 million and then beginning to carve it into the respective funds that have restrictions, as you say, Mr. Mayor, strings attached to it by the agencies who gave it to us, will further then boil down that money to what the council has a latitude to spend generally on anything of a municipal purpose. But all of this becomes very complex and frankly makes it very difficult for us to boil down in an easy statement for the public to understand what the city's resources are and how much you can spend, although Ron's done a nice job on this next slide.
And are we going to get to that number, those funds that aren't restricted by statute or by grant? Yes. Yeah.
Yes. But let me also point out at the beginning, as we're fond of saying in this business, there is more than one way to skin the cat. If the council, and we want to disclose everything to you, make sure you understand where everything is, what the restrictions are. It's your responsibility to set the policy on how much you want to spend. For example, the GRA loan, as we pointed out before, the redevelopment agency owes the general fund $67 million. Now, they don't have $67 million to repay that, but they do have some resources. And if you made a determination as the agency board that you wanted to repay some of that out of whatever available resources they have, you can do that. And that would free up that money, and it would become a general fund resource for you then to decide how you'd want to allocate and spend. That'll have implications if you do that. Later on, when the central project area goes out of existence, it'll have implications on how much additional tax increment you can collect to repay that debt. But so long as you understand those implications, ultimately it's your policy to determine whether you would want to repay it now or wait till later, and if you repay it now, how you want to spend those resources. We just want to make sure as we go through this that you understand all those implications.
Mr. Draymond.
Ron, on this slide 5 where it says less policy / legal restrictions, at some point in this PowerPoint, or if it's not in here at some point later, would it be possible to see something that differentiates those? Because everywhere in the packet we were given, those two phrases are glued together like they are like they mean the same thing, and they don't. Less policy / legal restrictions. Policy is one thing, and legal or charter issues are entirely another thing, and they appear together everywhere. For example, on page 3 of the packet, where it talks about, and this is just one of many places, formal reserve policies have been established for the electric and water fund only, and refers you to Exhibit D. While we have not established formal reserves in other funds, they nevertheless have, again, restrictions based on legal or policy considerations. And you have to continually ask yourself, if they are council policy, then they're not restrictions. So, but they're constantly put together. So I'd like to see something that differentiates between them, in addition to that bottom line number that I guess we're all eventually going to get to here.
Okay, Mr. Starbird.
It strikes me, in looking forward to the next, 15 or 20 slides or so, that maybe there's a way to cut to the chase a little bit on this. If we went to Exhibit A, for example, which is the first legal size table you have there, it's pretty clear just by their nature, a good number of our funds, you're not going to have the ability to utilize those resources for general municipal purposes. I mean, there's a whole host of them. Let me just take an example. Housing Assistance Fund, Home Grant, Supportive Housing, Emergency Shelter. You might as well put a check by those because you can only spend those for housing purposes. You can't spend those even if you wanted to for general municipal purposes. And there isn't even a way to skin that cat to get that money into general purposes. And a lot of these
We're skinning too many cats here in Glendale. So
I'll try and
use a more humane analogy.
I'll try and do that.
Be happy with
My point is we may want to very quickly before we go, because I think a good number of these slides are talking about a lot of the accounting philosophy underpinnings, and it might be easier to just take this chart for a minute, Ron, and run through, because there's a whole host of these funds. You might as well put a check by, and we can set those off aside because they're not going to come into your discussion at all.
So these are the legal
versus
not necessarily policy, but the legal.
Why don't we turn to Exhibit A for a minute?
Just a clarification, Mr. Starbird. Where, for example, and when I was looking at this earlier, on the extreme right, where it says federal restrictions or grant restrictions or state and federal restrictions, and, for example, one says city policy restrictions, and there again we put policy and restrictions together, but the bottom line is, as an example, where it says federal restrictions, pick any of them, does that mean that that specific dollar amount that is listed here entirely is the restriction, no more, no less?
It's actually all the revenue that we receive under that grant or that program has that restriction.
If it says federal restriction, you might as well put a check by that fund. And if the purpose here is to identify the resources that are available for this city council to appropriate for general purposes, or let's say for the items on the unfunded list, those that have federal restrictions, you might as well put a check mark by that because none of that money could be used for that purpose. Now, when we get to CDBG, community development, there's a possibility through the CDBG program that some of those funds could be used for some of the capital improvements in the appropriate areas of the community. So that's one that we'd say, community development and housing, CDBG component, maybe some of that money could be. But, for example, the home grant, you might as well put a check mark by that number because you can't use that for anything but new housing construction programs that are authorized by the federal government. Right, Jess? So it might be useful just to quickly go through the funds one by one so we can kind of begin to boil this down a little bit, if that would be useful.
Okay.
Start boiling, Ron.
Try.
We can start with the general fund.
Right.
Except for the charter provision, free game.
Right. You have here our general fund. We have cash in our general fund of $42.5 million. Our total fund balance, as we've already talked about, is $116 million. Out of that, we would subtract encumbrances of $2.5 million. Our charter reserve, which we've talked about, $16,495,000. And then the due to the general fund, which is the redevelopment agency debt of $67.1 million. So we have unreserved, unrestricted of $30.2 million. We would take out the reserve for the UUT. Again, now is set by council policy, so we could have that be zero, have it be greater. This just buys us 1 year of implementation time if our utility users tax does take a hit from the wireless revenue of $4 million. So that leaves us an available fund balance in the general fund of $26.2 million that can be spent on any purpose.
Is that? Can you clarify that again? Is that above the 30?
No, everything.
Ignoring our policy of 35%.
This is ignoring. That is correct. This is ignoring the council policy.
Okay.
So we can change the council policy.
So it's just that 12% charter reserve of 16.5
That is correct.
million. Okay.
Yeah. If this really is a useful table the way Ron has set it up because it starts with the cash balance that would be reflected on our balance sheet at June 30 of 06 and our total fund balance. It takes out those balance sheet items that would be that you'd need to take out because they're not really resources available for appropriation. It notes the charter reserve in this case, gets you down to your $30 million that Ron referenced, which if by policy the council wanted to spend this, the council has the authority to do that by changing your policy on reserves and directing it to be appropriated and spent. Okay. Now, Ron then backs out the $4 million that has been by policy restricted for the UUT and arrives at another net figure, which is the available fund balance. But again, by council policy, the total $30,172,000 as of June 30 of '06, and I think this number will go up by another
8.4.
$8.4 million when we close the books for June 30 of '07. We've noted that in the budget review sessions. That number will go up by another $8.5 million because of our savings and surplus at the end of '07. So you have in the neighborhood of $38.5 million at the end of '07, June 30 of '07, that the City Council, by its direction, could set policy on its continuing to be reserved or being appropriated.
Ron, 2 years ago, as we were looking forward, I think we were confident that we wouldn't face the crisis with the UUT tax. Is there anything looking forward that is even out there that may cause us another hit to the reserve that, as small of a risk as you might see? I know UUT 2 years ago wasn't a big issue for us. We were certain that, was it the LA case that was going to prevail, and you never know how the courts go. Anything out there on the horizon that is on a radar screen that we should at least keep in the back of our minds as we look at these things, whether it's state raiding our coffers or you're
Right.
better versed in the risks.
I do not see anything out there. We have protection because of Prop 1A with the state rating.
Mr. Starbury.
Yeah, if I can, we may see it more indirectly. For example, the governor has just recently decided to take a piece of Prop 42 and divert that money for other purposes in order to shore up his financing program. As a result, we'll probably get impacted on the resources potentially available to purchase replacement buses. Now, Prop 42, as it relates to street and roads, we think is going to be secure, but it's mostly those state, what do we call the resources, the state grant money that we get that's going to be more susceptible. Prop 1A 2 years ago gave us a lot of protection for our general fund resources, sales tax revenues and the likes being rated by the state. So we're much less susceptible than we were before. But the state still has a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit they need to address. And when the state goes looking for money, those of us at the local level get on guard because one never knows. But at this point, the UUT is probably the biggest threat we have out there, and we don't see any other threats of that magnitude on the horizon.
The only other threat you could have, which is very difficult to forecast, is a recession.
Right.
And when we know they're going to happen, we just don't know when.
PEG fees we're okay with. That's been negotiated, and we have an agreement.
Well, a couple of years from now, that'll begin to land, and we'll probably be losing resources in our PEG money. Additionally, as more and more of these services are offered through wireless and the likes, we're just going to see those kinds of hardwire resources, franchise fees. UUT is going to be impacted just long term. That's happening all over California. Everybody's facing it.
And we're having those we are forecasting as things develop. We are using that to forecast next year's revenue or the following year's
That's a
revenue.
couple $1 million,
Yeah.
right? It's not a hugely critical amount, something you could work with. Okay. Sorry to interrupt.
The next series of funds are called special revenue funds, which we've already started going over, but these are all, if you will, these are all...
Yusefian.
On the Exhibit A,
Yes.
with the exception of the $26 million, is there anything else in here that is not restricted?
Yes.
Just go over the list of stuff that is not restricted, not the restricted stuff. It's restricted, we know. Just the purpose in here is to find out what's not restricted.
Right.
Just go through
It's that bottom line.
Sure,
Let's get down to the
bottom line.
Yes.
Special revenue funds are all restricted except for the police augmentation fund, because that was set up by council to provide funding for the 25 officers, which is actually 36 staff employees in that fund. And so that is all set up by council, and we seeded that fund with $10 million to buy the general fund time to absorb these costs.
So the
So if
question
you will,
is-
that is unrestricted, but realize there's 36 bodies in here. that are being paid for out of this fund.
Question is, can general fund currently absorb those 36 bodies?
No. No, it's depending
It
on this
cannot.
fund. So if you made a decision to eliminate this fund, for example, and use its resources someplace else, the general fund is going to have to be adjusted to absorb the hit. This plan was over 10 years. The general fund comes up to absorb the full impact. For that 10 years, this fund subsidizes the gap the general fund can't afford to pick up, and then at the end of 10 years, the general fund has completely absorbed it. But let me back up just a second. And again, I don't do this to be confusing. I do it because we want to have full disclosure here, and it gives you some sense of how these funds work. Local transit. We happen to expend all of our local transit money on support of our B-line service. Some components of, is it Prop A or is it Prop C that has some
C.
flexibility for streets? C. In some communities, they spend a portion of their Prop C money on their street maintenance and street improvement program, because you can do that under Prop C guidelines. Here in Glendale, we're completely vested in the B-line service. We use all of our Prop A and C for B-line up. I'm still on Exhibit A. It's just further down the list. It's called Local Transit Fund. That's our Prop A and C money. So coming kind of through the back door, when we look at the unfunded projects list, and streets as a piece of the unfunded projects list, in some communities, they use a portion of their Prop C money for supporting the street maintenance program. We don't do that here. I suspect we did at one point in time, but since we never have.
No, we never have.
Okay, so we never have. That is a flexibility in the use of your local transit money, but here in Glendale, we wouldn't be able to do that unless we want to cut back on our B-line services. So again, there's a fund that is, you probably aren't going to have any discretion over, but you do technically have some discretion over the Prop C component of it. Okay. Air quality, you can't, just going down this, air quality you can't touch. Narcotic forfeiture, there is some flexibility within the police department on how those monies can be spent, but frankly there isn't much money there and it's very nominal. I mean, there's very little latitude in how the money can be spent to
Well,
support
it's a
police
state
services.
and federal provision.
Yes, there are restrictions.
Restrictions.
There are restrictions on how it can be used. It's used to support the police department. It's not much, and they have a little bit of flexibility in how they use it. They've been supporting, for example, the first 2 years of the fitness and wellness program, which is justified, but it's very limited in how that money can be spent. And frankly, there isn't very much there to worry about.
Going down, GRA, you also have that kind of flexibility where you can spend money in the project areas for public works types improvements, but otherwise that has state restrictions on what it can be spent on.
Can we again back up a little bit?
Sure.
Let's come back up to the electric public benefits charge one, which is up under the special revenue funds. There's one that again you've got some latitude in how those funds can be spent. They have to be spent for specific purposes, which is to reduce reliance on electricity, to look for ways of conserving. We have used this to help the college in some of their capital improvements, to help the school district in some of their capital improvements. We've used it here in the Civic Center campus to do some retrofits and reduce our reliance on electricity. Those public benefit charge resources are generally to benefit the private sector, and we've got programs structured for small businesses, large businesses. So there can be, as we look through some of the capital improvement programs, there can at times be a way that we could utilize some of these money to help support a particular capital improvement project, such as retrofitting a building, upgrading a building, that you might be able to tap some of this for those purposes, but it's going to be generally very limited in what you can do with it.
And that item is coming back to us.
Right.
for
You're going to get a
further
full
discussion.
report. Right. The paramedic fund, if this had a positive balance, this is one that you could decide to eliminate the paramedic fund, and you could roll paramedics completely into the general fund and use whatever balance they have. They happen to have a negative position, so that's not going to do you any good. The fire communications one is a joint powers authority, so we make a contribution, but this is really all of the 11 agencies' money, so you can't touch that. ISIS is all grant money. So out of all those special revenue funds, you've got 2 of them that maybe you've got a little bit of flexibility in how you use it, but the money isn't very big, and the flexibility you have is very limited. That takes us down to GRA.
Right. And now, GRA, again, you can spend money for public works in the project areas. As Mr. Starbird also mentioned, if we wanted to repay some of the city debt, then we could also do that, and that money could then be used on whatever purpose. But that does restrict your collection of tax increment in the future after 2013, I believe it is.
And to spend, with the exception of housing, to spend money outside a project area, the agency has to determine that that it's going to be a benefit to the redevelopment project area. You've got pretty broad discretion to make those determinations, but you generally have to determine that the money you spend outside the project area will be of benefit to the project area. So Scott would probably tell you can go to a degree, but you get past that degree and you're going to have a harder and harder time to show the benefit to the project area, depending on how close or far away you are from the project area. Let's take the ARC, for example. The Central Park and the Adult Recreation Center is not in the project area, I don't think. But it is so close, it's right on the border, that you'd probably have an easy time if you wanted to spend some redevelopment agency resources to support that project, making a finding that it has redevelopment benefit to the project area. Now, let's take something happening up in the north end of town on Foothill Boulevard. Much, much harder time finding a benefit to the central project area. As it relates to housing, low affordable housing can be done anywhere in the community and does have a public benefit and a redevelopment benefit. We allocate 20% of all of our property tax revenues to the agency for affordable housing, which you're obligated to do under state law. You can allocate more than 20%, but we allocate the minimum of 20%. But you could allocate more than 20% for a given project, and as a result, you could do affordable housing anywhere in the community, and you can utilize the 20%, and you can utilize more than the 20% of redevelopment agency money if you wanted to.
Mr. Yusefian?
Okay. On the GRA, it says book value property held. This is the central project. It says $25,477,000. Is this before or after transfer of the properties to?
Before.
It is before.
It's before. We noted that earlier, that this number will.
Well, it was a larger number.
Right.
Then further down on, it says, the reason I'm asking, because further down it says town center project, $36 million, $476.
Right.
Okay. So town center all by itself is $36 million, and then what is the $25 million?
The town center project is the bond proceeds. So that's $36 million that the bond bought of land. The admin fund 1, or the $25 million that you're referencing, also includes a lot of land for the Americana that was bought prior to the bonds going out.
Okay, so this is
So you're gonna see
cash. The GRA had cash in hand.
Yes.
They
And
spent that money.
before-
Well, actually, they issued a bond earlier on, I think in '96 or whatever. So they used that money to buy this, and then on top of that, they borrowed another.
Right.
For
Some
the
of the
mo-
land we've owned since the 80s
Right.
down there.
For
in
the
Americana.
most part, the bulk of the combination of those two numbers are roughly $62 million is all the town center.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see the June 30, 07 closure, you'll see that number go down a lot.
Okay. Now, while we're at this, legal question from our astute legal guy.
If I can answer it.
That'd be a great new title, our astute legal.
Oh, the other astute legal guy. Oh.
Agency owes the city $67 million. Generally, we do not like to pay off our debt because under the state regulation allows you to collect tax increments until your debt is paid.
You need the debt.
Okay. If the agency goes out there and borrows, and there was talk about borrowing, let's say, $40 million, incurs a debt, uses that $40 million to pay part of this $67 million to the city. But agency still has that $40 million. So the $67 million debt is replaced by a $40 million bond and a $26.7 million that is owed to the city. Still the debt is there. Would that debt still be considered to be a debt and be we are able to pay for it from tax increments in the future?
I believe it is, and it's actually the way you actually there was a chart I think we put up on the board that
Yeah.
showed
Right.
up until a certain point based upon the date of when it was incurred, you could continue to collect the debt beyond a certain date, up to a certain date, and then a certain amount of debt you can collect beyond that period of time.
Right.
It would still be debt.
Okay. So we can actually change our debt ratio. So we could actually infuse. Now, I understand redevelopment agency cannot borrow more than what they physically can afford to pay or service the
So you
debt.
got to be able to service the debt.
But they can literally borrow a certain amount of money based on what the income is to the redevelopment agency, so they can service the bond, and then take that bond and pay off the debt, which will be able to be added on to this $26 million. So you have a bigger amount of reserves, correct?
You could do some of that. The question is whether or not that makes financial sense to do based upon both state law and the timing of being able to collect the debt, and based upon what you're going to be able to get and how long you're going to be able to get it.
Mr. Starbird.
It'll have the same.
Show me the fallacy on that.
Well,
Well, it's not, I'm not sure it's a fallacy.
yeah, legally you can do it, but from an economic standpoint,
Okay.
you're better off not doing it. Our numbers have anticipated issuing as large a bond issue as the redevelopment agency will be able to support prior to the central project area going out of existence. You could use that bond to pay off the outstanding debt, but it'll have the same impact on limiting the amount of tax increment you can continue to collect after the life of the project area. If you do the bonds and use it for whatever improvements you want to use it for, and keep the city's loan outstanding, you'll collect $67 million more over the life of your authority to collect tax increment than you would have otherwise done. Because right now we're anticipating, and the CIP carries a bond issue for the redevelopment agency that is very close to its maximum limit of debt it'll be able to carry, based on our current calculations, and recognizing you have a much shorter time frame to repay it. So we can't look at 30 years. We're having to look at 15 years, Phil, right, for a repayment, because the state limits not only the time frame in which you can issue it, but the time frame in which you can repay it. There's also some technical issues relative to when the debt was issued. There's pre-94 debt, there's post-94 debt. You have a longer time to repay pre-94 debt than you do post-94 debt. A lot of our $67 million was pre-94 debt, if not all of it.
It's about $55 million is pre-94 debt.
For that, you can continue collecting longer than you can for bonded debt that you incurred after 94. And that was the purpose of the table, which is if we're going to look at ways that we can maximize over the long term, continuing to draw tax increment into the community, the best way to do it is to sell as much bonds as you can possibly justify and support now, and keep as much general fund debt outstanding as you can. Then you will collect tax increment for the longest period of time.
Mr.
Which
Quintero.
will allow you to collect your 20%.
Well, right, which continues to have the 20% set aside for housing and the likes.
Has the staff looked at any projections when they look at the downtown condominiums, proposed hotels, some of the proposed projects on the San Fernando Road corridor? Have you looked at any potential revenues or what they may be?
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Quintero, yes, we have. In fact, if we have some of those projects that come online before we issue the bonds, we can take advantage of that. What we have to do is look at the tax increment that's being generated when we issue the bonds. There are in some cases we can anticipate those. Say we were going to issue a bond today, we certainly would be able to anticipate the Americana. It's under construction in the Embassy Suites.
I was going to say this depends entirely on what the bond market will let you do. But I have been involved in issuances where you do what's called an escrowed bond issue, where you try and reach out even farther than what you can see on the immediate horizon, and if you can justify it, you reach out to grab that anticipated property tax value, and then in effect those monies are escrowed until you actually generate. Those become very complicated issues, and I'm not even sure whether they can be done today
They
or not.
do, and they only let you go out, I think, 3 years.
The problem we have with the central project area is we have such a short life remaining on it. I mean, normally these bonds would be 30-year bonds. Now we're looking at 15-year bonds at the most, and every year that we don't do an issuance, we're losing. It's because next year it'll be a 14-year bond, then a 13-year bond, and it just gets a shorter and shorter window to repay. So your debt service burden gets that much higher, and of course, as a result, your issuance gets lower.
I'm not thinking in terms of the bond so much as just, does the staff or finance, do you have a ballpark idea of what some of these projects are going to generate? I mean, we know there's going to be the 5-star hotel and the condominium next to it and the other condominium at Glendale Fed, et cetera, et cetera. So do we have any ballpark projections? Do you?
Annually, right?
Yeah, annually.
Yes. In our cash flow model that you saw with our budget, we did anticipate certain projects coming online. We give them, based on industry standards, we give them a value that we anticipate they'll generate, put it into the cash flow at the time we think they'll come online with the assessor. And so that balance was, I don't have it with me here.
I'd like to know what that number is.
Yeah, Mr. Starber.
The other component of that is almost, if not more important, is what we're seeing in the resale values of our existing commercial properties in the downtown. City Center 1 is a very good example. That property in the course of 3 years has gone from about $70-some million in value, been sold 3 times. Now we hear it's about to sell again for about $130 million.
Somewhere short of that, of 120.
Yeah. I mean, that is phenomenal to think that one building that was originally booked 3 or 4 years ago for $70 million today is going to be booked and picked up by the assessor at about $130 million. That's a $60 million spread in 3 years. That's pretty phenomenal. And if we begin to see that in the downtown area, aside from any new development, that could have a big impact on our resources. The problem is we've got that currently between now and 2015. We've got an 8-year window to capitalize as much as we can, and to the extent we can establish debt that'll carry us past 2015, be able to continue to capture the tax increment for hopefully as long as we can past that. That benefits not just the redevelopment agency, what we can invest in the project area, but of course affordable housing as well. Because the affordable housing program, as we've come to know and love it, will end when we stop collecting tax increment on the central project area.
Okay, thank you. Ron, where were we? We were on Exhibit A going through
You're on
some of
Exhibit
those
A.
funds that are
Are we
untouchable.
done talking about redevelopment?
Yes, let's move on to
Okay.
the other fund.
Okay, debt service funds, the last 3 funds on page 1. The first 2 are redevelopment bonds, and this is the first call on our tax increment every year is to pay off these 2 bond issues, as you can see. So they have bond indebtedness restrictions by bond covenant. We can't spend these resources on anything but the principal and interest. The police building COP stands for Certificate of Participation. And you see here cash of $47.4 million. What we did for these bonds, it was a 30-year issue, is we set aside enough cash to generate interest, and also we will be reducing that cash balance down to 0 so that at the end of the 30 years, the bonds are completely paid off. So this was done by policy. The bond indenture is really just for the annual bond payment, which is sometimes hard to project, but it's roughly $3 million a year because it's a weekly bond and weekly interest rates fluctuate or can fluctuate.
By way of background, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we established this structure as opposed to paying all cash because we could utilize tax-exempt bonds at an interest rate less than what we earn on our money in our investments. And generally that spread is about a 1.25%, or what they call 125 basis points. But this is one of those, in the interest of full disclosure, there is no legal tie between this reserve, this cash we set aside, and those bonds. In fact, the city wasn't able to legally pledge this money. It couldn't be locked up legally for this purpose, because then you'd get yourself into an arbitrage situation where the tax-exempt bond regulations don't allow. So we reference this as policy restriction because, technically speaking, the City Council could decide we want to spend this $47.5 million, with the exception of the indenture reserves, which will generally be equal to 1 year's interest and principal, which is, what, $5 million, Ron?
$5 million.
So you could, decide you want to spend the $42 million that isn't required by the bonds to be set aside. The result of that would be the general fund then is going to have a $4.5 million debt service payment to make every year?
It'd be three. Three would be the debt service.
$3 million? So at that point in time, the general fund then would have to absorb the $3 million annual debt service payment.
So if we didn't use cash to borrow, what did we use to borrow? Because the building wasn't built, so you couldn't mortgage the building. Is this the one that we used our rolling stock and everything else?
No. The building is
Mortgage.
pledged.
So we did, but originally when we did it.
Right. The COPs means you've essentially sold a position in your building.
Okay,
You've
so we gotta
pledged your
take out
building
no
for the
down.
bonds.
Okay.
But of course, frankly, the bondholders don't look at the value of the building. They look at the importance of the building to the city, and as a result, they know they've got a lock on the city's general fund for these payments because we're not going to go without a police facility. And it was really the generals, or it was really the city's strong financial position that gave us the ability to sell COPs of that size. Otherwise, the bondholders never want to have to come in and take your building away. But again, in the interest of full disclosure, you could reallocate this $42 million, but we'd have to find a way in the general fund to then begin absorbing the annual debt service payment.
Is the $42 million generating enough interest to pay the loan?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we issued the bonds in July 2000, and we anticipated having a 146-point spread, or close to 1.5, and we are averaging, I think, 160 odd points.
Yeah.
So we're doing fine for
We've
the
made-
first 7 years.
We've made a lot of money on this.
Out of 30.
Now, one thing we could do at some point in time is to come back and assess how well this fund has done and whether or not this continues to need the full $47.5 million to support it. Because the benefit came at the amount of money we needed to borrow. I think we saved in the neighborhood of $9 million going into the issue versus spending all cash. So had we spent all cash for the building, we would have had to have spent $9 million more than we had to set aside, because we were able to utilize the tax-exempt benefits of the bonds in order to generate the cash that we needed. So we saved about $9 million up front in costs, and we're essentially saving money over the life of the bond issue, which is all factored back to determine how much cash we actually have to set aside. Now, if we did an evaluation and anticipated that, you know what, given the interest rates and the amount of spread we've been earning, that maybe we can do with just $46 million in this fund, then conceivably you could free up $1.5 million to go transfer someplace else and use it someplace else, and still be able to say we've essentially met the needs of this bond with no burden on the general fund for the life of the bond issue. And that's an evaluation we could do here in the next year or so.
That we could.
Okay. Let's keep going.
Page 2. The first grouping is our capital projects funds. Am I already there? I'm already there. We have 3 funds here. Our capital improvement, which this fund can purchase or build anything. There are no restrictions on this money. Has $26 million in cash. Our fund balance is very, very close to the cash amount, $26 million. We have encumbrances of $8 million. Principal and interest on debt on 3.7, and we have a footnote there. This is the Murchison property where we are buying that in installment payments. That will end in November of 2008. We have landfill post-closure maintenance. This is where we set aside the cash to maintain the landfill for 30 years after it closes, of $17 million. And then we have a negative number for unreserved, unrestricted. We have carryover projects, and I'll explain how all this works. Carryover projects of $16.3 million. This is all the appropriation. If you remember our CIP, we have literally hundreds of projects in here. So this is the total amount of the carryover appropriation of $16.3 million. And we... my throat is dry. We add back a little over $19 million, and what this is, and I put it under policy or legal restriction, I probably should have made another column. What this actually is money that we've already appropriated or spent, but we haven't received reimbursement from three main projects, and that is the SR 134 that's going into the Disney project, the I-5, and then the MSB as well. So we basically have zero money available in our CIP. Everything is appropriated. All the money is spent. It's all appropriated. It's all committed.
When do you anticipating receiving any of that $19 million?
It's all on a reimbursement basis. It's all grant funded, so we have to spend the money first, and then we receive the cash.
No, you said that we have spent $19 million.
I'm sorry. We have appropriated. It's a combination of appropriation and spent.
Did we spend the $19 million?
No. We have not spent $19 million.
So we bought a whole bunch of land for that purpose, and so on and so forth. So did we get reimbursed for all of those, or this is just for the cost?
This is the remaining appropriation. We've appropriated $24 million in one and 16 in another. And so what this is the remaining appropriation, if you will. Sorry, this is getting a little bit
and this
accounting.
This is the money that we pulled out of the jaws of death with Larry Zarian.
Out of the
From
jaws
transportation.
of death.
I'm
not sure.
That's a technical term that I'm not familiar
I'm
with.
not sure what you're referencing.
I thought the money, the Transportation Commission almost,
Yeah,
it kind of went away, and then Larry was able to bring it back.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember
okay.
Yusefian, this is, I believe, as Ron said, the remaining portion for the 134 project, the Fairmont flyover,
Right.
is the construction.
Okay.
That's the $15 million we recently received approval from CTC, of which Mr. Zarian is a member of that.
Okay, that's what I was. So $15 million of this $19 million is for that,
Correct.
and the rest of it is for the what? For the
The
interchange,
I-5.
the 5 interchange.
Right, the I-5 interchange, which we're still working on property acquisition with regards to that project. So although that's moving slower, it's moving.
Okay, now that we got the money appropriated, can we move forward with this project?
You will see
On the
plans and
bridge?
specs next Tuesday, Mr. Yusefian.
Okay, good.
Mr. Quintero.
Down at the bottom, I see the $1.6 million loan to Embassy Suites. That was the value of the land, or what is that number? At the bottom of exhibit.
Right. That's
Right.
part of the GRA loan that's on the prior page, the 3.4. The 3.4 is composed of 1.8 to the school district and 1.6 to Embassy Suites.
And that was the value of the land.
Value of the land, right.
That was correct.
The next fund is our state gas tax money, of which we annually receive a little over $4 million. We have cash of 8.3. Our total fund balance is 8.5, and I'll just skip all the way across to where available fund balance is 0. This has the state restrictions on. It can only be used for street and street-related purposes. So that's why we have the comment there of state restrictions.
And is fully programmed by Public Works, right, Steve?
Right. If we have unreserved, unrestricted of 5.6, we have carryover projects of 5.4. So we have 200,000 that has yet to be appropriated as of June 30th, 06. So that's fully appropriated. There's just 200,000. Our police facility construction. This is our COP issue. This is where the bond proceeds went, and we still have $1.8 million that is left in that fund, and we're still having minuscule expenses come in from legal, I believe, for this last year. And
So
then we're done.
this will get closed out at some point?
This should be closed out very soon.
Okay, and what do we expect the balance will be?
It should be very close to that. Probably be $1.5 million, $1.6 million.
And
We have the restrictions on the bond covenant on what this can be used for, which if we wanted to open it up, we could go back and redo the bond covenant to spend it on another public use. We just have to meet the tax exempt threshold.
well, one thing we should look at is the 10. You generally have about a 10% leeway, and it could be that the 1.6 is much less than 10% of the bond issue.
Oh yeah, the bond was
yeah.
64.
So we could probably
Over 50 million?
I'm not sure we'd have to go back to the covenants, Probably within that 10%, this would fly. We need to have bond counsel look at it, but this could be available. I mean, it's clearly within the 10%, so you usually have about a 10% leeway to use tax-exempt bonds for non-tax-exempt purposes without getting challenged by the IRS on the taxability.
We can check with our bond counsel.
Yeah, we can check with bond counsel, but likelihood is once this project's closed out, this could be freed up and could go back into the CIP.
Or we could pay down the debt
Could pay
a little
down
bit
debt.
early by. There's multitude of uses for this money.
Mr.
Nick?
Raymond.
Yeah, just as a clarification, when you talk about, a restriction, doesn't mean the money necessarily can't be used for another purpose, but it has to be used for another, it might have to be used for another purpose, or would have to be used for another purpose that would still satisfy the for example, you couldn't take unallocated funds from, let's say, Glendale Water and Power reserves or whatever you would call them and use them necessarily to build a fire station, but you could use them to do a street lighting project if we felt, such as this council did in Montrose.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
So when we say they're restricted, doesn't mean they can't be touched necessarily.
Right.
It all means how it can be touched.
Yes.
The next grouping of funds is our enterprise funds. These are our businesses, recreation, hazardous disposal, parking, sewer, refuse, electric, and water. Recreation fund has $1.2 million in cash and has available unreserved unrestricted of $1.1 million and available none. But again, this is set by council policy, so we could use this money for other purposes. We don't have any restrictions by the federal government or the state government on this money, so we could use this money, but it is set aside as an enterprise operation in order to fund all of the programs from the Parks Department.
So this was entirely local policy.
Right. This is entirely, and that's why there's nothing under the comments under any kind of restriction. Or
If
what
it
have you.
goes away, what happens to all the programs?
Well, if this is just an accounting structure, you could fold all of recreation into the general fund. In which case, the fund was set up to track the programs assigned to it supporting themselves.
Right.
So we account for the revenues and expenditures in the fund.
Right.
You could keep all the programs and eliminate the fund and roll it into the general fund. In which case, all the revenues would go in the general fund and all the expenditures would go into the general fund.
Right. What I'm trying to understand is this money, the $1 million, is this a surplus or is this money being used to basically run your programs for that 1 year period? It's money that is there to generate money. It's like the general fund. You got to have seed money to run your program because it's
probably been built up over
This
time.
is right. This is surplus over the many years that the recreation fund has been in existence.
Their programs has just made a little bit of a profit each year. Sometimes it's lost, sometimes it's been ahead.
Right.
This money has just continued to build up over the years because they've had more years of profit than they have had years of loss.
And some of it is, like the Civic Auditorium. The losses are taken out of this fund as well. So it is a surplus, but it does get impacted.
Okay.
that's true too.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm being told, and generally in recreation, if they need to buy equipment or something, they don't have an equipment set-aside fund. So they generally look at buying their capital. They may make a capital expenditure that isn't supported by current revenue flows. They'd make that out of the reserve. That might take the reserve down at times.
For example,
but generally it's been built up over time from their savings.
The equipment at the sports complex is all bought out of that.
Was it?
Yep.
Okay.
Has this account been used to do some maintenance work like clean up?
It does, yes, at the sports complex and some of the sports fields.
Because the sports complex is a 4-fee
It's all
facility, so
enterprise.
that's all booked in here.
Right.
But you can't use this money, for example, for car park to, let's say, sandblast all the picnic tables and paint them.
Oh, I think we can.
Well,
I'm
you
not
can.
sure. Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way: you can, but they normally wouldn't,
Right.
Because car park is a general fund park, and this money was set up to support the enterprise operations like the sports project.
Right.
But so they generally wouldn't because it runs contrary to the policy. But the city council could decide we're going to take this money out and use it for any purpose you want to. It's not. It's only restricted by your policy.
Okay, so this is money to be used only in those facilities that are considered to be
Fee-based.
fee-based.
Right. Civic Auditorium, Freeway Sports Project.
So it's not the activity, it's the facility.
It's both.
Right, and it's also
It's
like
both.
the leisure guide and all the activities. That
Let's understand, it's both. It's
Right.
both programs and facilities.
activities.
So
Yes, we have, let's say, all the tennis courts in different parks. Because tennis is considered to be recreation, would the maintenance of all those fields be paid from this money?
It could. It hasn't been at this point. The revenue from the tennis courts really isn't enough to really offset that, but it could be used for that.
we don't have, our tennis court concessions are not in this fund. They're in the general fund,
Yeah,
the
I
general
believe
park?
so.
I believe so as well.
Okay.
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 Next fund is our hazardous disposal fund. It has $900,000 in cash. Our fund balance is a little bit greater at $1.1 million. This has a state restriction on it by Prop 218 that the fees that are charged have to be spent for this purpose. Parking fund has cash of $4 million. Total fund balance is a lot greater at $36.9 million. This is recognizing the value of the 3 large parking garages that are in the downtown at the Exchange, the Marketplace, and over on Orange Street. And you can see that is under the column investment in capital assets of $33 million. So our unreserved is very close to our cash at $3.9 million. And again, there are no restrictions on this money. You can use this money for any purpose, but I would like to point out that we are not even, with only $4 million in cash, we are not even setting aside enough money for the eventual rehab or refurbishment or replacement of these 3 large parking garages.
Oh, question.
Mr. Yusefian?
Marketplace, not the Exchange parking structure, had major structural issues. Has that been dealt with? Is that going to be dealt with somewhere down the line? It was dealt with. So we replaced all those concretes and everything else. So this $4 million is more than
Parking fund
that's
paid for
already
that.
been parking fund took care of all that stuff.
Our sewer fund has also the restrictions on it by Prop 218 for the majority of the fees that are collected in the sewer fund. There's some fees that are collected in the sewer fund that are not not restricted by Prop 218. But we have $71.6 million in cash. You can see our total fund balance, again, is huge, $203.8 million. Again, reflecting our investment in our infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure, not only within the ground of the city of Glendale, but also reflecting our investments in LAGWRP, which is Los Angeles Glendale Water Reclamation Plant, and the Hyperion Treatment Plant that we are part of the amalgamation agreement with Los Angeles on.
How much is the LAGWRP?
How much is it?
Yeah. I mean, I understand we have Hyperion, but how much of this 203 is the LAGWRP?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Yusefian, it varies. We don't know. That's part of the reason why we're keeping the balance as high as we have. I think I've mentioned a couple of times in past CIPs, the City of Los Angeles, as they came here and explained to Council their integrated resource plan, they have a master plan for the future, and that includes possibly some upgrades to LAGWRP, possibly not. And as I said, we're going to fight for those upgrades if we have to. But to give you an idea of some of the
That's
things...
not what I asked. Out of $203 million, that is our total fund balance, that is $131 million is the capital asset, okay? And that is Hyperion and LAGWRP. What I'm trying to understand is how much of the assets, capital assets, is the LAGWRP? Is it $30 million? Is it $20 million? What do we own there?
I do not have that
Do we
number
own
for
a
you.
third of
I
it?
can.
Do we own half of it? What do we own?
Mr. Yusefian, here's how the City of Los Angeles views it. We have a 50% capacity ownership. Here's how I view it. We have a 50% ownership, period.
So we would say we are an even partner with LA in the ownership of the land and the building and all the pertinent equipment. Their position will be, no, you bought capacity in the City of LA's plant. Okay. And we have never agreed on that.
Despite our donation of land to the project. Now, to answer your question more specifically, we are still arguing over that exact number. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we come to, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to get agreement from them on the number. So what I'm going to do is go ahead.
What's your number?
And get my number, and I'll pass that on. I don't have that number available now, but I will get that number to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. John.
I want to go back to one thing related to the enterprise funds as a whole. It's a side note, but I just want a clarification, and I wanted to wait till the city manager was back. I was looking at some of the operations related to the city civic center, the civic auditorium. Thank you. And I was looking at that related to proposal of perhaps the people at the Alex also operating that, or whatever. Anyway, and I noticed, and I was curious, with an enterprise fund, when we're using, we meaning various departments of the city, are using the facilities or other, say the schools, our schools district is using those facilities, and we decide to just not charge, write it off, so to speak, or we use their personnel to deliver materials or set up materials or our assets, physical assets that we send to this event and that event and so on, and we don't reimburse that fund. How does that work exactly, this enterprise fund?
Well, I can answer. We do have a joint use agreement with the school district, mm-hmm. and we don't charge if it's normal working hours where we have staff there that would actually staff the civic anyway. Anything above and beyond those hours, we would charge back to the school district for the use of the staff time, not the facility, but the staff time.
But for example, I don't know, a given department, any department decides they're going to do some function, mm-hmm. either there or somewhere else in the city.
Right.
And we have them pull chairs and a stage and other props and equipments and send them to a location. They set it up. They're there. Then they tear it down. Then they send it back. They unload it and restock it. All of that. But then it is not reimbursed out of that department's budget, so to speak. Right. And that seems to be, as I start looking at the numbers, I see that over and over and over. And so I'm wondering, how is that reflected? And if it's an enterprise fund, is that even allowable?
Right. In prior years, it was a loss. It was, the civic auditorium would just eat the cost of that through the enterprise fund. But we have been charging back to the departments for use of staff time and equipment.
Since when, by the way?
Boy, we had an audit when I first came in. That was part of the recommendation, the audit. I think in the last year and a half, we have been charging back. It's the city manager's office that we don't charge back on, mm-hmm. but all other departments are required to give us account numbers, and we do charge back on it.
Really? Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ron, we definitely want to finish before noon. I'm going to give you a 10-minute warning.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to note, we won't finish this up today then, because I suspect the electric, water, utilities, and then discussion of the internal service funds is going to again take some time. So we'll probably want to take up whatever we don't complete next week.
Okay. Refuse disposal fund. Our cash position is $6 million. Our total fund balance is 15.4. Again, reflecting our investment in our capital assets. Not only the refuse trucks, but they actually constructed the building down at the integrated waste management yard. So this is reflecting the land and the building improvements down there on Chevy Chase. And we are subject to Prop 218 restrictions on this fund as well. So the fees that are charged have to be used for these purposes of refuse collection and recycling and so forth.
And they have to be reflective of the actual cost of providing the services. Now, there you do have some flexibility, charging administrative overhead, charging support operations, sometimes deciding which programs get loaded into those enterprise funds. You'll have some discretion over, but Proposition 218 says you can't make a profit on these activities. It used to be the general fund. In cities that had enterprises, they could just decide to take as much money as they wanted to and build it into their rates. Prop 218 said, no. There's got to be a direct relationship between your actual costs of providing the services and your fees.
So we don't transfer any money to general fund?
We transfer what we can justify or has been authorized, like in our charter.
Okay. Can you use this money for buying new trucks?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Anything related to the operation.
And we are...
I know we're going to buy a bunch of trucks.
Right.
I just want to know where.
And let me point out again, there's different approaches to trying to solve problems. I'm inserting that instead of saying skin a cat. You can decide to allocate a program to an enterprise fund. Let's take our NPDES challenge that'll be on the horizon, Steve. It is possible at some point that if we have NPDES obligations, you may have the leeway to establish either an enterprise fund or to look at some component of that as being related to refuse disposal. And we'll look at means of possibly utilizing the refuse fund and those fees, if you can justify it under Proposition 218, as a way of offsetting what may be growing costs and obligations. Now, ultimately, that's a council policy decision to make. But it may be under Prop 218 that you'd be able to justify that as a refuse program.
And Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we've been working very hard to try to get the state legislature to recognize the NPDES program the same way that they recognize refuse, sewer, and water, potable water, so we can go through the process that we go through when we do our rate changes, which is a little bit easier than going to a full vote of the people. Right now, any NPDES program would have to go to the full vote of the people. It would have to be put on the ballot, and it would have to be passed.
How are you going to deal with the state water resource board's recent decision that says you have to capture all your rain fallout and capture it, clean it, and pump it back into the ground?
This would be a monumental task. First of all, we're still waiting to get exact.
You can't use any of your sewer fund or this fund at all. The state is not allowing you to do that, but it's making a regulation.
As Mr. Starbird stated, we will review both of those funds to see the limits in which we have to try to put forth some of those monies to help us with our NPDES program. We're doing it now.
So the real question is, could this be a hit in future years
Absolutely.
on the general fund, and how much? How much would be?
It's going to be huge.
Well, this is millions and millions of dollars, Mr. Mayor. We're very, very lucky.
3 million, 10, 15 million?
You're looking at somewhere between 10 and 20 conservatively right now.
Probably
And
more.
this is a city, mind you, that has a very stout stormwater conveyance system. This is not a city that has a poor system, so that you first have to build the conveyance infrastructure even before you get to the point of trying to deal with the water treatment. But, as I've come before you and talked about the trash, just the one BMP, the trash, which our very, very talented staff came up with some options for us to try to deal with that on a much more cost-effective basis. When I first came to you, you remember, $500,000 for a vortex unit, of which I thought we probably need at least 10. That's just to put them in the ground. That is not even to maintain them. So we were looking just for one BMP, thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think when you get down to bacteria, to the metals TMDL, to the nitrogen, it's going to be very, very interesting where we go from there. And I personally think that there's a drive towards us processing our stormwater the same way we process our wastewater, which is to treat it.
These are the things that I want to hear from, and if it weren't for Mr. Yusefian's
Skag. I heard
lengthy,
he said Skag 4
lengthy,
years ago.
Lengthy discussion and questioning, I probably would have, had I cut him off a minute ago, this wouldn't have come out. So these are the things that when I talk about radar and potential hits to general reserve, this is precisely one of the things that I'd like to hear about from any other department if you come next week please let us know or mention to the city manager or to Ron, not that they don't know it already, but these are the things that we want to know about. If there's something looming out there that could be a legitimate and probable issue that we might have to deal with.
Well, Mr. Mayor, it's been a while since I've given my stormwater presentation to the council, which
I may have
covered
forgotten
this.
about it.
I don't think you were here, Mr. Mayor. I think it's been a while.
That means
so.
I missed it too, for sure.
Absolutely, Mr. Draymond missed it.
And there
So
are
maybe
new
it's time
changes.
for me to come back and give you not only an update, but go back through the bones of this thing so you can see exactly what we're facing.
Mr. Starr.
And the crux of this, Mr. Mayor, is on how you described the threat. This is one that's out there. It is still pretty nebulous. There are cities, many, many cities, that, frankly, this is the nuclear alternative for them because they don't have the conveyance system.
They don't.
I mean, they're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in communities that are smaller than us. And at this point, well, there's a big lawsuit outstanding.
Many
that
lawsuits.
is going to take this out for we don't know how many more years. But what we bristle at is the state saying, you know, we're going to impose these very significant obligations, and oh, by the way, ignore the fact that you have Proposition 218 out there that's going to limit your ability to collect any fees or charges to pay for this. But this has a long way to run before the end of it comes up.
It does. There's a lot more to come as each TMDL is rolled out and each new permit comes online. There is a tremendous amount of effort and fight that goes into each one of these. I will tell you, though, the thing that bothers me most is this whole issue of what they call MEP, maximum extent practicable. That's what we were told we had to do. The courts have essentially said it means nothing to us. There's also an economic factor that's in Porter Cologne, which is the equivalent of the Clean Water Act in the state, and which takes precedent over the Clean Water Act because it's more restrictive. Economic, out the window. Doesn't matter what it costs you, you need to do it. So those things are causing a lot of consternation among cities, and that's why these lawsuits and these, I can tell you the Ventura County permit just came, it's not even finished yet, and we watch that very closely because I'm sure Ventura County permit will be very similar to what we'll be required to do here in LA County, and our permit is expired and under consideration now, but probably will come up after Ventura County is approved, much more restrictive than even the one now. Each 5-year period becomes more restrictive.
I mean, we're thinking about ways and determining the amount of money that could be used towards this lengthy CIP list. And what I personally don't want to happen is for us to assume we've got, let's say, $15 million and we can do this project and that project and this other project, and then wham, shortly thereafter we get hit with this. It could be any one of another sort of threats that come home to hit us. And
and I think, Mr. Mayor, it'd be a good idea for me to go through this because there's a couple of things that are on the horizon. One, the County of Los Angeles is exploring a countywide fee to be assessed for this program, countywide. We think that'd be a great way to go if the county can pull that together and assess a countywide fee. If that doesn't work, I would also propose to you, short of having stormwater added to the 218 list, is to talk about our own vote here in the city of Glendale to establish the fee. I thought 5 years ago that'd be a tremendous uphill battle, but since that time, the city of Los Angeles has passed one by 72%, which was very surprising. I think if you lay it out right, you can get a lot of support for this type of a program. Of course, what I would like to do, and it's something I'll come back to you with, is start to test the waters, bring somebody in to start polling and surveying the voters of this city to see if it's even viable. Because I'll tell you, as the city of LA said, if you can't get about 75% of the folks in the preliminary to agree to it, it's not even worth putting on the ballot. So,
this was reflected in their refuse fees, correct?
no, this is a separate fee.
A separate.
A separate fee. So they set up, and they set up actually what it amounted to was a bond issue for their stormwater system. But there's many other cities who, since this first came online, have put into place stormwater fees that they've gone to the voters with. I'll tell you, I said 5 years ago I was skeptical. The first city that did it in this area, San Clemente, barely passed it. Can you imagine a city that sits on the beach that has the most impact from this type of thing was barely able to get that passed?
Okay, why don't we start? Any concluding remarks, Mr. Yusefian, because we need to wrap up.
Are we doing, since you do also plan checks and all this stuff, are we doing anything to also reduce the storm runoff? We, in some cities, have come up with, let's say, single-family residential. They require you create some kind of a dry well, and so your storm rainwater, instead of going into the street, they capture it by pipes and goes into the dry well and just gets absorbed into the ground, and that type of stuff. Are we doing any of that with our new regulations?
We are, Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Yusefian. As you know, I have a staff dedicated to stormwater, especially one particular individual who is involved in the plan check process and sets forth conditions on plans and also on conditions through the entitlement process of major projects. That is one option that you can look at a project and say you need to have full capture, you need to have some sort of a device that captures that.
Right. The reason I'm asking is because I have not seen one that has been asked to do that yet. That's why I was asking, are we doing anything to start reducing the amount of... Because when it rains, what happens, you build all these hillsides, all these flatlands, you basically create an impervious surface.
Right.
So the rain can penetrate, so now you capture it off your roof, get it through your gutters, downspouts, and you shoot it right into the street, and it just goes down and into the stormwater.
Right.
If you don't do that, if every single house stopped doing that, that would reduce the tremendous amount of water.
And
then you would have to process somewhere down the line.
And Mr. Yusefian, what the water board is pushing heavily right now is infiltration. That is what they'd like to see. That's recharge, putting it back into the ground. So as you said, you take open land and you put a roof and a driveway and a patio and a street. You've put hard surface, impervious surfaces where water is going to run off. So, one option is to have some capture and well system and deposit it, whether you put it into the sewer system or some other system to keep it out of the stormwater conveyance system is one option. What we're looking at now more than anything is trying to develop landscaping and infiltration programs to keep the water as much as possible on site.
Okay, we're sort of getting off the
I will come back with a full report
direct
on
budget relevancy, and we're just about 11:56. Mr. Starbird, can we expect another, I'm not sure, in terms of the number of slides we got through, we certainly didn't do very well, but I'm not sure how much ground we covered.
Well, I think this has been beneficial. I mean, we've made a lot of headway here. I think you've got almost this much effort ahead of you yet, only because these are some very interesting funds ahead of you with some rather large balances. The utilities, all of the internal service funds will be a very good discussion. So I see us taking the next meeting, cleaning up the balance of these and doing some recap. We'll cull out of the PowerPoint presentation some of the accounting information you should know about this, so that when you arrive at whatever that final number is, you'll have a sense of how within the accounting structure that's treated. But I think we've made great progress today.
Is next week okay with everybody? 9:30?
And we'll start with the GWP Electric and Water.
Mr. Draymond.
It's fine with me. I just wanted to add that I thought this was, for me anyway, far more helpful and useful than the PowerPoint, to be very honest with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, what we did this morning...
And maybe we can get a slide of that as we go through it so folks at home can follow along.
We'll try and do that so we can kind of do a recap of what we went through very quickly next week today for the public, and we'll put it on a PowerPoint.
And Mr. Mayor, for Councilmember Weaver, who is following along at home, I'm sure right now, I'd also just like to say I was here. I was here. That is not why we started late.
Let the record reflect.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and attention.
Motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
We're adjourned.